Hello and welcome. China is not the threat you think it is. The real danger is what comes after. Right now, in Washington, London, Brussels, some of the most powerful strategy rooms, they are focused on one question, one single question: how do we stop China? War games simulate battle around Taiwan. Defense budgets are rising across NATO. Entire military doctrine are being rewritten. But here is the uncomfortable possibility, and very few people in those rooms want to say out loud. What if China isn't the real danger? What if the biggest threat to global stability doesn't come from a rising superpower at all? What if it comes from something far more chaotic, far harder to predict, and far harder to control? Because history has a strange pattern. The world really collapses because one power rises. It collapses when the system that holds power together begin to fracture. And if that sounds abstract right now, you need to stay with me. Because once you see the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. I am Dr. Adeel. For years, I have studied geopolitics both as a researcher and as a someone who spent time inside newsrooms trying to make sense of global power shifts. And what I have learned is this: the most important stories are often hidden behind the loudest headlines. This is In Focus with Dr. Adeel. So let's come to the question: why should we care today about China? Let's start with something very simple, very easy to digest. When Western leaders talk about the future of global security, the conversation almost always circle back to China. China's economy is enormous, no doubt about it. And China's navy is expanding faster than any fleet in modern history. Similarly, China's technological ambitions stretch from artificial intelligence to space. And if you live in United States, Europe, Canada, or Australia, that debate affects your life more than you might think. So defense spendings are increasing in all Western countries. Trade policies are shifting. Supply chains move from one country to another. Even inflation can be affected when geopolitical trade disrupts. In other words, the China conversation isn't just about geopolitics, it is about jobs, economic stability, and national identity. So the focus on China isn't irrational, but here's where I want you to pause for a moment and think, because global history keeps showing us some uncomfortable things. Um, the threat leaders prepare for are not always the threat that actually arrive. Think about the early 1990s. The Cold War had just ended. The United States was the dominant global power, and many analysts believed the world was entering a long period of stability. Instead, what happened? The next decade produced something very different: the Balkans War, state collapse in parts of Africa, and eventually a terrorist network that changed global politics overnight. None of those crises came from a rival superpower. They came from system breakdown. And that raises a difficult question. What if the next era of instability looks less like a superpower confrontation and more like a world where state power itself begin to weaken? So let me show you what that shift already looks like. Across the world today, more governments are struggling to maintain control. Debt levels are rising, and Political polarization is deepening everywhere. Climate stress is beginning to reshape entire regions. Now, none of these problems automatically cause a conflict, but they do something very dangerous. They weaken the institutions that keep societies stable. And when states weaken, something fills the vacuum. Non state actors, militias, private militaries, private armed companies, and cyber groups that operate outside the authority of any government. What makes this moment different from previous eras is the technology gap has narrowed. 30 years ago, only government could launch sophisticated cyber attack or deploy advanced drones. Today, that capability is spreading. Small groups can disrupt entire infrastructures, hack financial networks, even influence political systems across borders. And suddenly security landscape began to change. Instead of a predictable world of rival powers facing each other across borders, we began to see something far more chaotic. A world where power fragments. And that fragmentation is where the real risk begin to multiply. Now let's talk about where this trajectory could lead. Because in next layer of this story is the climate pressure. And I want you to think about climate not as an environmental debate, but as a stress multiplier for political systems. When rainfall patterns shift, and in result agriculture suffers, and when agriculture suffers, food prices rise, and when food prices rise, government face pressure from their population. This pattern has already appeared in several regions. It's not a new thing. In the years before Syria's civil war, the country experienced one of the worst droughts in its modern history. Hundreds of thousands of farmers were forced into cities. Economic pressure intensified, and political tensions followed. So, climate alone didn't cause the conflict. That's what I'm not saying. But it pushed a fragile system closer to collapse. Now, imagine that dynamic spreading across multiple regions. And they are spreading simultaneously. Parts of Africa facing water shortages, South Asia experiencing extreme heat waves, coastal regions dealing with rising sea levels. So each of these pressures create migration, economic stress, and political instability. And when those pressures overlap, governments can struggle to maintain order. That instability doesn't stay local. Migration waves across borders, supply chains break down, regional conflicts spill into neighboring countries. Suddenly, global stability begins to look far less secure. But the story does not stop here. There is more to it, because the most disruptive element of this future may not be environmental or economic. It may be technological. Artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and autonomous weapons are lowering the barrier for power. Capabilities once reserved for major governments are gradually becoming accessible to smaller actors. And when that happens, the balance of power begin to change in ways traditional military planning struggles to understand. This is the most important factor, which brings us to the most important question of all. Here is the argument that many geopolitical analysts quietly debate. China may not be the defining threat for the next era. The real danger may be global fragmentation, because strong states, even rival ones, operate within predictable frameworks. They have diplomatic channels, They have economic incentives, political leadership that must answer to internal pressures, but fragmented power behaves differently. Militia do not follow international law. Cyber networks cannot be deterred by traditional military forces. And private actors controlling resources or technology may operate entirely outside national boundaries. And when several of these forces intersect at the same time, the world begins to resemble something less like a chessboard and more like a wildfire. A fire spreads unpredictably. It jumps barriers, it feeds on instability, which means the greatest strategic mistake government could make is preparing only for a traditional superpower rivalry while ignoring the slow erosion of the global system itself. Because when systems fracture, the risk multiply in ways even powerful states struggle to manage or mitigate. So let's be clear, China matters, it matters a lot. Its rise will shape economic stability and military competition for decades, but the future of global stability may depend on something even bigger. Whether the international system itself remains strong enough to contain the pressure building inside it. History suggests that when systems weaken, the resulting instability spreads far beyond the region where it begins. And that is the scenario policymakers increasingly worry about behind closed doors. Not just a world where China rises, but a world where order itself becomes fragile. If there is one idea I want you to remember from this conversation, it is this: the greatest geopolitical danger really comes from the threats everyone is already watching. They come from the systems quietly breaking beneath the surface. So, if this video changed the way you think about global power, subscribe the channel. Thank you very much. You are watching In Focus with Dr. Adeel.